If you take one single step closer to this porch, I will break you in half." The voice thundered across the dusty courtyard of the old Elias ranch, rich and heavy, vibrating with a desperate, cornered fury. Garrison pulled his weary roan gelding to a halt at the crest of the ridge, his hand instinctively dropping to the worn leather of his holster. Below him, 3 town deputies and a sneering land surveyor were slowly circling the main cabin like a pack of starved coyotes. They had come for the helpless orphan the late Elias had left behind, expecting an easy eviction. They were dead wrong. The townsfolk thought they were dealing with a frightened, fragile child, but what stood on that porch was something else entirely. What the town believed was not the whole story, not by a long mile. I want you to stay until the very end of this memory, because the journey of these 2 fractured souls will challenge everything you think you know about strength. Tell me down below where you are listening from, and let us see how far this story travels across the world. Because some legends, especially the quiet, unspoken ones, deserve to be heard everywhere. Garrison nudged his horse forward, the heavy hooves crunching loud against the dry, baked earth. He had ridden 400 miles through high country snow and barren plains to honor a sacred life debt to Elias. The letter had spoken of an orphan, a fragile thing that needed a guardian after the old man passed. Garrison had fully expected to find a weeping girl. Instead, as the prairie dust cleared, he laid eyes on Tallulah. She stood well over 6 feet, a towering mountain of a woman clad in a faded, form-fitting red dress that was torn near the shoulders. Her arms were heavily corded with thick, striking muscle carved by years of brutal, unforgiving ranch work. Her massive thighs clearly visible against the strained fabric as she braced her wide stance, anchored her to the porch like ancient oak trunks. Sweat and dust painted her strong, resolute face, though beneath the grime and the wild tangle of her blonde hair, there was an undeniable striking grace. She did not hold a rifle. She did not need one. In her massive, calloused hands, she held an entire shattered wagon tongue, brandishing the thick oak timber as easily as a man might hold a willow switch. "The old man is dead, you freak," the surveyor spat, though he took a cautious, trembling step backward. "You do not have a lawful claim to this dirt. Now pack up your rags and leave before we burn you out." Garrison did not shout. He did not rush. He simply dismounted, the heavy thud of his worn leather boots echoing like a drumbeat in the tense, breathless silence. He was a colossal man himself, broad-shouldered and weathered by war and harsh winters, his sun-bronzed face carved into an emotionless mask. He walked straight through the circle of armed deputies, completely ignoring their startled gasps, and stopped halfway between the sneering men and the towering woman on the porch. "The lady told you to leave," Garrison murmured, his voice a low, lethal rumble that carried perfectly in the dry mountain air. He did not draw his weapon. He merely let his scarred hand rest casually upon his belt, his sharp, observant eyes pinning the surveyor in place. "I suggest you men find your horses before I forget my manners." The deputies exchanged nervous, wide-eyed glances. They were local bullies, armed with false confidence and fraudulent papers, but they recognized a seasoned, dangerous killer when they saw one. The surveyor opened his mouth to argue, took one look at Garrison's cold, dead stare, and then glanced back at Tallulah, who had not lowered her makeshift weapon a single inch. Muttering bitter curses, the cowards turned on their heels, scrambling onto their saddles and kicking up a thick cloud of cowardly dust as they fled toward the town limits. Silence settled over the isolated ranch, heavy and thick. Garrison slowly turned to face the giant woman. Her chest heaved with heavy, labored breaths, the raw power of her imposing frame trembling slightly beneath the fading adrenaline. Her deep blue eyes watched him with intense, guarded suspicion. She had lived her entire life as an outcast, feared for her imposing size, mocked for her wild strength, and sheltered only by the old rancher who was now buried on the distant hill. "Elias sent for me," Garrison stated quietly, offering his empty, calloused palms forward to show he meant absolutely no harm. "He saved my life at Shiloh many years ago. I came to repay the debt. I came to watch over his girl." Tallulah slowly lowered the heavy timber, the dense wood thudding heavily against the porch floorboards. She studied his weathered, stoic face, searching for the disgust or the mockery she had seen in every other man who had ever looked at her. She found none. She saw only a quiet, respectful stillness. "Elias is gone," she whispered, her voice surprisingly soft, a gentle, musical contrast to her overwhelming physical presence. "There's nothing here for you. I am not leaving," Garrison replied softly. A long, tense moment passed before she finally stepped aside, gesturing toward the heavy wooden door of the cabin. She did not trust him, but Elias had trusted him, and for now, that was barely enough. Garrison stepped into the dim interior, his sharp eyes quickly adjusting to the shadows. The cabin was immaculately clean, smelling of dried lavender and warm wood smoke, a stark, beautiful contrast to the wild, beastly reputation the town had assigned to her. But as he turned to set his heavy saddlebags by the stone hearth, he noticed her immediate, intensely defensive movement. Tallulah did not move toward the kitchen or the comforting fire. Instead, she crossed the room with terrifying speed for a woman of her immense size, planting her towering, heavily muscled frame directly in front of a sturdy oak door that led beneath the floorboards. It was the cellar door, bound in thick iron hinges and secured with a massive rusted padlock. She stood with her broad back pressed firmly against it, her jaw tight, her hands curled into massive fists, fiercely guarding whatever lay in the darkness below. Her eyes darted toward him, filled with a sudden, desperate panic that made Garrison freeze in his tracks. Garrison did not ask what she guarded in the dark. A man who had survived the bloody, smoke-choked fields of the war knew well enough that every survivor kept ghosts locked away where the light could not reach them. He simply offered a slow, respectful nod, turning his broad back to the cellar door and unbuckling his heavy leather gun belt. For the next 2 days, they moved around each other like wary wolves sharing a winter territory. Garrison attempted to take over the heavy labor of the ranch, assuming the massive burden of frontier chores. He quickly learned that the towering woman required absolutely no assistance. From the corral fence, he watched in quiet awe as she repaired the storm-damaged barn alone. Tallulah lifted massive pine beams effortlessly, the thick, heavy muscle of her biceps and shoulders shifting under the thin fabric of her red dress. Dust clung to her sweating skin, highlighting the immense physical power she possessed. Yet, when a frightened barn cat scurried across the rafters, those same massive hands paused, waiting patiently so the tiny creature could pass without fear. She was a giant crafted of iron, hiding a gentle heart made of spun glass. That quiet rhythm broke completely on the third morning. The sharp crunch of carriage wheels shattered the dawn silence. Garrison stepped out from the stables, wiping axle grease from his rough hands with a cloth. A polished black buggy sat in the center of the yard, and a man wearing a silver sheriff's star stood on the porch, holding a rolled parchment. Tallulah stood squarely in the doorway, her towering frame blocking the entrance, her jaw clenched tight. "The county court has made it official," the sheriff sneered, waving the paper like a weapon. "An unnatural beast cannot hold a legal deed in this territory. The land goes to auction by the end of the month. You will pack your rags, or I will return with 20 armed men and drag you out in chains." Tallulah did not flinch, but her broad shoulders tightened. The deep, agonizing wound of lifelong rejection flashed briefly in her bright blue eyes. They did not see a woman. They only saw a monster. Garrison closed the distance between the stables and the porch in a dozen long, predatory strides. He stepped directly between the sheriff and the door, his towering frame shielding the giant woman from the cruel, mocking eyes of the lawmen. "You will do no such thing," Garrison stated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that sent a chill through the crisp morning air. The sheriff scoffed, puffing out his narrow chest. "And who are you to speak for this creature?" Garrison stepped 1 inch closer. The air around him grew instantly heavy with unspoken violence. "I am the executor for the estate of Elias. Furthermore, I am a witness to the humanity, the grace, and the undeniable legal right of the lady standing behind me. She is no beast. She is the rightful owner of this soil. If you return to this property with 20 men, you had better bring 20 coffins." The sheriff swallowed hard, the arrogant sneer vanishing from his face. He looked at the cold, dead certainty burning in the eyes of the scarred veteran, then glanced at the towering woman who watched them both with absolute, breathless shock. Without another word, the lawman dropped the rolled parchment into the dust, climbed back into his buggy, and whipped the horses toward the valley. Garrison watched the buggy disappear, his posture rigid and commanding. Slowly, he bent down, retrieved the false eviction notice, and tore the paper into small, jagged pieces. He let the wind carry the fragments away into the wild prairie grass. When he finally turned around, Tallulah was staring at him. No one in her entire life had ever stood up for her. No one had ever called her a lady. For the very first time since he had arrived, the fierce defensive wall behind her blue eyes cracked, allowing a tiny, hesitant seed of trust to finally take root. They spent the afternoon working in silent harmony, side by side, replacing rotting fence posts along the eastern ridge. The shared labor felt like a quiet conversation between two lonely souls who had forgotten how to speak. Tallulah drove a heavy iron digging bar into the hard earth with immense rhythmic strikes. She brought the bar down with a powerful grunt, but instead of the dull thud of packed soil, a sharp metallic clang echoed across the ridge. She paused, wiping sweat from her brow, and knelt into the dirt. Her massive, calloused fingers brushed away the loose soil, revealing a rusted tin box buried deep beneath the earth. Garrison stepped closer, resting his gloved hands upon his waist as she pried the stiff lid open. Inside the small container lay a handful of silver coins, a faded photograph of Elias as a young man, and a single sealed envelope. The paper was yellowed with age, protected by the heavy tin. Tallulah lifted the letter delicately, her thick fingers treating the fragile paper with immense reverence. She turned the envelope over. Her breath hitched in her throat. She slowly raised her gaze, looking up at the stoic horse trainer standing beside her. The ink on the front of the envelope was faded but entirely legible, written in the unmistakable shaky handwriting of the old rancher. The letter was not meant for her. The name written across the front was Garrison. What heavy, terrible truth had Elias hidden in the dirt for all these years, waiting for this exact moment to be found? Garrison gently took the yellowed envelope from her trembling fingers. He did not open it. He simply traced the faded ink of his own name, feeling the heavy, unspoken weight of a dead man bridging the space between them. Before he could slide a fingernail beneath the wax seal, a sudden, violent crack of thunder rattled the valley floor. The wind shifted instantly, carrying the sharp, bitter scent of an early mountain squall. Garrison slipped the sealed letter into the inner pocket of his heavy leather vest, nodding toward the darkening horizon. The sky above them was churning into a bruised, violent purple. They had animals to secure. The mystery of the old rancher would have to wait. The storm struck with blinding, chaotic fury. Rain lashed against the valley in sideways sheets, turning the sun-baked dust into slick, treacherous mud. They worked desperately side by side, herding the panicked, thrashing horses into the safety of the main stalls. The wind howled against the valley walls like a wounded animal. Over the deafening roar of the tempest, a sharp, terrifying crack echoed from the dilapidated eastern shed. Garrison sprinted through the blinding rain, his boots sliding wildly in the muck. Tallulah was already ahead of him, moving with terrifying, explosive speed for a woman of her immense size. They reached the ruins of the shed just as the structure surrendered to the gale. A massive oak support beam had snapped under the sudden pressure, collapsing the heavy slate roof inward. Trapped beneath the splintered timber, pinned against the freezing mud, was a newborn roan foal, whinnying in absolute paralyzing terror. Garrison grabbed the thick timber, his broad shoulders straining against the impossible weight. He gritted his teeth, his weathered face tight with exertion. The wood did not budge a single inch. Then Tallulah stepped beside him. She dropped to one knee in the freezing mud, ignoring the sharp splinters that tore at the wet fabric of her red dress. She wedged her massive, scarred shoulder directly beneath the crushing center of the oak beam. She closed her eyes. The thick, heavily corded muscles in her enormous thighs coiled tight against the earth, anchoring her towering frame like roots driven deep into bedrock. She drew in a massive, shuddering breath. She drove upward. The heavy timber groaned, fiercely fighting her strength. The rain poured in relentless sheets. The wood snapped and cracked. She let out a deep guttural roar against the storm, a sound of pure, unadulterated willpower. The muscles across her broad back flared and trembled under the sheer, agonizing strain, yet she did not waver. Inch by agonizing inch, the giant woman hoisted the crushing weight of the collapsed roof upon her own shoulders, holding the deadly timber suspended in the air. Garrison lunged into the narrow, muddy gap. He gathered the terrified foal into his strong arms, dragging the fragile creature out from the wreckage. The very second they were clear, Tallulah threw the massive beam aside. The roof collapsed completely with a deafening crash. She fell heavily into the mud, gasping for air, her chest heaving with exhaustion. Inside the warm, dry sanctuary of the main barn, the violent storm faded into a steady, rhythmic rain against the shingles. Tallulah sat upon a pile of golden straw in the dim lantern light. The shivering foal lay across her massive lap. Her thick, calloused fingers stroked the trembling creature with breathtaking, agonizing gentleness. She hummed a low, sweet melody, wiping the mud from the delicate ears of the frightened animal. Garrison stood in the shadows, entirely motionless, watching her. He had seen strong men break under the brutal weight of war. He had seen power used exclusively to dominate and destroy. Yet here was a woman, towering and wild, possessing physical strength that terrified an entire town, using her immense power solely to shelter the fragile. He saw past the wild dust, the formidable height, and the heavy muscles. He saw a lonely, beautiful soul that possessed enough quiet love to warm the entire bitter frontier. Profound admiration, tangled with a quiet, undeniable attachment, bloomed deeply within his guarded chest. The storm passed completely by mid-afternoon, leaving behind a misty, quiet valley. The rhythmic squelch of heavy horse hooves suddenly broke the peaceful silence of the ranch yard. Garrison and Tallulah stepped out from the barn. 3 riders had entered the property. The man in the center rode a magnificent silver-saddled stallion. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, an expensive bowler hat, and a pocket watch that gleamed in the pale sunlight. His face was carved into a cruel, aristocratic sneer. This was the wealthy land baron who pulled the strings of the local sheriff. The baron did not look at Garrison. He locked his cold, dark eyes entirely upon the towering woman. "I see the old man finally died," the baron murmured, his voice dripping with poisonous amusement. "I wondered how long it would take. Tell me, little runaway, did you truly believe I would forget the stolen property that escaped my traveling carnival 20 years ago?" Tallulah froze completely. The color instantly drained from her strong face. Her massive hands began to tremble violently at her sides, paralyzed by a deeply buried terror that shattered her imposing presence. What dark, iron-barred nightmare had Elias rescued her from? And what right did this cruel man hold over her life? The baron laughed, a dry, rattling sound that held absolutely no warmth. He looked at the trembling giant of a woman with immense, sickening greed. Before he could speak another poisoned word, Garrison moved. The seasoned veteran did not shout. He did not draw a weapon. He simply walked forward, placing his towering, broad-shouldered frame entirely between the wealthy man and the terrified woman. "You have precisely 10 seconds to turn your horse around," Garrison murmured, his voice dropping into a lethal, gravelly register. "If you are still breathing the air on this property at the count of 11, I will drag you from that saddle and bury you in the mud." The dark eyes of the land baron narrowed. He recognized the absolute, unyielding violence radiating from the scarred horse trainer. He pulled his stallion back, his cruel smile returning. "You cannot protect a freak forever, soldier," the baron sneered, adjusting his expensive bowler hat. "I own the supply lines. I own the general store. Effective immediately, this ranch is completely cut off. No food, no winter supplies, no medicine. We will see how long you survive the mountain snow when the hunger sets in." With a sharp crack of the reins, the wealthy man and his hired guns rode away, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating silence. Winter arrived precisely 3 weeks later, descending upon the valley with brutal, unforgiving speed. The wealthy baron kept his cruel promise. The town enforced a strict malicious boycott. The local merchants refused to sell them a single sack of flour, a single tin of coffee, or a single spool of thread. The old ranch became a completely isolated island, buried under 3 feet of crushing, blinding white snow. Yet, the bitter isolation did not break them. Instead, it stripped away the remaining walls between them, forging an unbreakable reliance. Garrison quickly learned that the towering, wildly muscular woman possessed a domestic grace that entirely defied her intimidating exterior. When the temperature plummeted, threatening to freeze them in their sleep, Tallulah kept them alive. Her immense physical strength allowed her to split massive cords of heavy firewood single-handedly, keeping the stone hearth roaring with life against the lethal freeze. But it was her delicate, gentle homemaking skills that truly became their salvation. She knew exactly how to stretch their meager, dwindling rations. She transformed tough, salted meat and dried root vegetables into rich, life-sustaining stews that filled the small cabin with a rich, savory warmth. In the quiet, freezing evenings, she sat by the fire, using a tiny bone needle to meticulously mend the torn wool of his heavy winter coat. Her massive, calloused fingers moved with breathtaking precision, weaving warmth and care into every single stitch. She created a sanctuary of absolute comfort within the heart of the deadly mountain winter. One particular night, the blizzard roared furiously against the cabin walls, rattling the heavy timber. The firelight cast warm, dancing shadows across the cozy room. Garrison sat near the hearth, carefully oiling the heavy leather of his riding harness. He watched Tallulah as she folded a mended blanket. The silence between them had long ceased to feel heavy or guarded. It had become a comfortable, intimate shelter. Garrison stared deep into the orange flames, the flickering light playing across the deep, faded scars on his face. "I led 50 young men into a valley much like this one, far to the east," Garrison murmured suddenly, his voice a low, heavy rumble of ancient guilt. "The military orders were foolish, I knew it in my bones, but I followed them anyway. I brought 5 men back. The rest remained in the bloody mud. For years, I believed I did not deserve the air in my lungs. I believed I was entirely hollow." Tallulah paused her mending. She looked at the stoic, dangerous man, seeing the profound sorrow he carried beneath his formidable, protective armor. She slowly reached out, resting her massive, warm hand gently upon his broad shoulder. The simple, silent gesture offered a profound comfort that clumsy words could never achieve. "You are not hollow," she stated softly, her deep musical voice vibrating with quiet certainty. "You are simply carrying the weight for those who cannot." Garrison looked up, his sharp eyes locking onto her bright blue gaze. A profound intimacy blossomed in the quiet space between them. Tallulah slowly withdrew her hand, looking back at the dancing fire. "He put me in a cage," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, raw with a vulnerability she had never shared with another living soul. Garrison set the heavy leather aside, giving her his complete, unbroken attention. "I was 10 years old," she continued, a heavy tear escaping her eye. "I was already taller than most grown men. The Baron owned a traveling exhibition. He locked me in a rusty iron cage. He painted my face to look like a wild beast. The townspeople paid silver coins to throw heavy stones at the monster. They laughed. They spat. I believed I was exactly what they called me." Heavy, silent tears traced down her strong, resolute face. "Elias saw me in a town square," she breathed, wiping her cheek with the back of her massive hand. "He waited until midnight. He broke the iron lock with a heavy sledgehammer, wrapped me in his own coat, and carried me away. He raised me here. He gave me a home. But the world outside this valley will never see a woman when they look at me." Garrison rose slowly from his chair. He crossed the short distance between them and knelt directly in front of her. He reached out, taking her massive, scarred hands into his own weathered palms. He did not pity her. He looked at her with profound, unwavering reverence. "They are blind," Garrison murmured gently, his voice thick with raw, honest emotion. "I see the hands that saved a fragile life from the storm. I see the hands that keep this hearth burning. I see the strongest, most beautiful woman I have ever known." Tallulah let out a soft, shattered breath. She lowered her gaze, her massive shoulders trembling as years of toxic shame began to slowly melt away under the warmth of his genuine acceptance. For the first time in her entire life, she felt entirely safe. She felt seen. Hours later, the storm outside seemed to fade into a dull, distant roar. Garrison fell into a deep, exhausted sleep upon his bedroll near the fading embers, wrapped in a profound sense of peace. He awoke much later to a bone-chilling, biting cold that sliced violently through his heavy wool blanket. The fire had died down to a faint, struggling orange glow. Garrison sat up quickly, his sharp eyes scanning the dim, freezing room. The heavy oak door of the cabin was swinging wildly on its iron hinges, banging violently against the wooden wall. A blinding wall of white snow howled relentlessly through the open doorway. Tallulah was gone. Garrison did not hesitate. He did not freeze. The violent wind screamed through the open doorway, carrying the lethal, bitter bite of the high country blizzard directly into the cabin. He threw his heavy wool coat over his shoulders, seized his rifle from the wall, and plunged directly into the blinding white fury. Panic, sharp and metallic, tasted like copper in his mouth. He could not lose her. Not after finally finding a breath of peace, not after finding a soul that matched the quiet sorrow of his own. The snow outside was knee-deep, a heavy, suffocating ocean of shifting white. Garrison pushed forward with brute force, leaning his broad shoulders heavily against the gale. He searched the ground desperately for any sign of her deep footprints. The howling wind erased the tracks almost instantly, but he found a single broken branch of winter pine snapped by someone moving with immense haste toward the eastern pasture. She had not run away. She had heard something out in the freezing dark. Then a sound completely shattered the roaring wind. A howl. Not one, but several, rising in a chilling, chaotic chorus. It was the sound of starving timber wolves, driven entirely mad by the winter famine, hunting the only fresh meat left in the valley. Garrison breached the crest of the frozen ridge and witnessed a scene of absolute terrifying chaos. Near the edge of the dark timberline, the few remaining cattle were huddled together, bellowing in absolute terror. Standing directly in front of them was Tallulah. She held a massive iron-tipped pitchfork, her towering frame entirely exposed to the biting snow. Surrounding her were 6 massive gray beasts, their eyes glowing like yellow coals in the darkness. She lunged forward, swinging the heavy iron with explosive, terrifying power, driving a leaping wolf back into the shadows. She was defending the very livelihood they needed to survive the long winter, risking her own life to ensure they did not starve. Garrison raised his rifle. The loud crack echoed over the howling wind, dropping one of the beasts instantly into the snow. He chambered another round, but the freezing ice jammed the lever solid. The weapon was useless. He threw the rifle aside and drew his heavy hunting knife. Charging down the slippery ridge to stand by her side, they fought back-to-back in the relentless storm. Tallulah possessed raw, unstoppable power, tossing a leaping beast aside as if it weighed absolutely nothing. Her massive muscles strained beneath her freezing clothes, a magnificent display of wild, protective fury. But the snow blinded them both, swirling in violent, dizzying circles. A massive, deeply scarred alpha wolf circled silently behind the towering woman. It coiled its heavy hind legs and launched itself directly toward her unprotected back, aiming straight for her neck. Garrison did not shout a warning. There was absolutely no time. He threw his own body directly into the path of the leaping beast. The heavy, foam-flecked jaws clamped violently onto his shoulder and upper chest, tearing deeply through the thick wool and sinking deep into his flesh. Garrison let out a low, guttural roar of agony. He drove his steel blade upward, striking true, ending the beast instantly. The heavy animal collapsed into the snow, dragging Garrison down with it. The remaining wolves, seeing their leader fall and facing the explosive fury of the giant woman, scattered rapidly into the dark timberline. Silence returned to the pasture, broken only by the whistling wind and heavy, labored breathing. Garrison fell heavily into the red-stained snow, clutching his torn shoulder. Tallulah dropped her iron weapon. She crashed to her knees beside him, her massive hands shaking violently as she pressed them against his terrible bleeding wound. Her warm tears fell, freezing instantly upon her pale cheeks. She realized the stoic horse trainer had willingly sacrificed his own life to protect her blind spot. "Do not close your eyes," she pleaded, her rich voice shattering into a raw, desperate sob. "You stay with me. You cannot leave me." Garrison looked up at her, his vision fading rapidly at the edges. He reached up with his uninjured hand, his calloused fingers lightly brushing away a frozen tear from her strong jaw. He offered a weak, trembling smile, finding profound peace in her beautiful face before his eyes slowly drifted shut. "No!" She roared into the blizzard, a sound of pure, unadulterated anguish. Driven entirely by a terrifying fear of loss, Tallulah scooped his massive, lifeless frame into her powerful arms as if he weighed nothing at all. She stood tall against the raging storm, holding him securely against her broad chest. She marched back through the deep drifts, her muscles burning, her heart pounding with a desperate, frantic rhythm. She reached the edge of the property line, her lungs burning with exhaustion, desperate to bring him to the warmth of the hearth. But as she looked toward the cabin, she froze completely. A dozen bright, unnatural orange lights flickered violently through the falling snow. The sheriff, the wealthy baron, and a mob of angry townsfolk stood directly at the main gates, holding blazing torches and heavy rifles, waiting for her. The torches hissed violently in the falling snow, casting long, menacing shadows across the frozen earth. 20 armed men stood shoulder to shoulder, blocking the heavy wooden gates of the Elis ranch. The local sheriff held his Winchester rifle firmly against his shoulder, aiming directly at the towering woman emerging from the blizzard. Beside him, the wealthy baron sat upon his silver-saddled stallion, a cruel, triumphant smile twisting his aristocratic features. They had come to enforce the starvation, to drive out the monster they believed inhabited the valley. Tallulah stopped walking. Her massive chest heaved with brutal exhaustion, her lungs burning from the freezing air. In her powerful arms, Garrison lay entirely motionless, his blood soaking through her torn red dress and dripping heavily into the pristine white snow. "Put the man down and step away from the property," the Baron ordered, his sharp voice slicing through the howling wind. "The time for your stubborn defiance is over. You do not belong here. You are nothing but a wild beast, and you will leave this valley tonight." Tallulah looked at the wall of hostile faces. She possessed the raw, explosive strength to tear through their line. She could have grabbed the heavy iron gate and swung it with enough terrifying force to shatter their bones. A beast would have fought. A monster would have raged against the dying light. Instead, she slowly sank to her knees in the freezing snow. She did not release Garrison. She cradled his broad, heavy shoulders with breathtaking gentleness, wrapping her massive arms around him to shield his fading warmth from the bitter wind. She bowed her head, her tangled blonde hair falling across her face. "Please," she whispered, her rich musical voice breaking into a raw, shattered sob. She lifted her face to the mob. Thick, heavy tears streamed down her strong, resolute cheeks, freezing instantly upon her skin. Her bright blue eyes held absolutely no malice, no violence, and no threat. They held only profound, devastating sorrow and a desperate, beautiful love. "He is dying," she wept, holding the stoic veteran closer to her heart. "He gave his blood to protect me. I do not care about the land. I do not care about the deed. You can take it all. Just save him. Please, save him." The armed men froze completely. The sheriff slowly lowered his rifle, the cold steel dropping toward the snow. The townspeople stared in absolute breathless silence. They had marched up the mountain expecting to find a terrifying, soulless creature. Instead, they found a fiercely protective, desperately frightened woman begging for the life of the man she loved. The profound dignity and the raw, unadulterated humanity radiating from her towering frame shattered their prejudice entirely. "Do not listen to her," the Baron snarled, spurring his stallion forward. "She is playing a trick. Raise your weapons." Then no one moved. A heavy, shameful silence fell over the mob. From the back of the crowd, an older man carrying a worn leather satchel pushed his way forward. was Dr. Vance, the town physician. He glared up at the wealthy baron with absolute disgust. "You make me sick," the doctor muttered. Dr. Vance turned his back on the wealthy man and knelt in the snow beside Tallulah. He placed a gentle, reassuring hand upon her massive, trembling shoulder. "Carry him inside, child," the old doctor instructed softly. "Let us save your man." The mob parted silently, their eyes lowered in profound shame as the giant woman carried the bleeding hero through their ranks and into the warmth of the cabin. For 3 agonizing days, the blizzard raged outside while Tallulah kept a quiet, desperate vigil beside the stone hearth. Dr. Vance had stitched the terrible wound, leaving behind bandages and a heavy bottle of medicine, but the fever had set in deep. Tallulah rarely slept. She bathed Garrison's heavily scarred forehead with cool water, her massive, calloused fingers tracing his weathered features with profound longing and deep emotional reverence. She realized, in the heavy silence of the cabin, that her own heart was entirely bound to the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. On the 4th night, the wind finally died down. The fire popped and crackled softly. Garrison shifted weakly upon the mattress. A sudden, violent shiver racked his broad, muscular frame. The fever was breaking, but his mind remained trapped in a hazy, delirious dream. He tossed his head against the pillow, his lips moving silently before a low, raspy murmur escaped his throat. Tallulah leaned closer, her heart leaping with desperate hope. She brushed his damp hair back, listening intently to his quiet rambling. "Elias," Garrison breathed, his eyes rolling blindly beneath his closed eyelids. "I found your letter in the dirt. I read your words, old man." Tallulah froze. Her breath caught sharply in her throat. "You ask too much," Garrison muttered bitterly into the shadows. "You want me to marry her. You want me to take her as a wife, just to give her a legal name against the town, just to save the deed. I cannot do it, Elias. I cannot marry her for that." Tallulah stumbled backward, her towering frame suddenly feeling entirely fragile. The beautiful, quiet trust she had built shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. He did not care for her. He was only here because a dead man had begged him to offer a ring in exchange for land. The small, warm cabin suddenly felt as cold as the howling blizzard outside. Tallulah stood frozen in the center of the dimly lit room, her immense strength entirely failing her for the very first time. The delirious words of the feverish man echoed violently in her mind. "I cannot marry her for that." He was only here out of a rigid obligation. His gentle hands, his warm smiles, his willingness to bleed in the snow, it was all a transaction. It was a heavy duty bound by a dead man and a yellowed letter buried in the dirt. She slowly backed away from the bed, her massive frame trembling, and sank into the heavy wooden chair by the frosted window. The deep, agonizing ache of lifelong rejection settled firmly over her chest, suffocating her. She had foolishly allowed herself to believe that a man could look past her towering height and heavily muscled shoulders to see a real woman. She had allowed herself to hope, and that hope now tasted like bitter ash. Hours crawled by in agonizing silence. The fire popped and hissed. The gray, pale light of early dawn began to filter through the thick ice on the window panes. Garrison let out a long, heavy sigh. The violent shivering had completely stopped. He opened his sharp eyes, blinking away the lingering, hazy shadows of the fever. He shifted his broad shoulders, wincing slightly as a dull, throbbing pain radiated from his bandaged wound. But his mind was finally clear. He turned his head toward the hearth. Tallulah sat on the far side of the room. She did not rush to his side. She sat completely rigid, her bright blue eyes devoid of the gentle warmth that had grown so beautifully between them. "You are awake," she whispered, her rich voice entirely flat and distant. Garrison frowned, instantly sensing the heavy, shattered wall that had slammed down between them. He pushed himself up onto his good elbow, his weathered face tight with confusion and concern. "What happened?" he murmured, his voice hoarse and dry. "You look as though the entire world has ended." Tallulah stood up slowly. She walked over to his discarded leather vest, reached into the inner pocket, and pulled out the yellowed envelope they had unearthed on the eastern ridge. She placed the fragile paper gently upon the small table beside his bed. "You spoke in your sleep," she stated quietly, refusing to meet his observant gaze. "You spoke of Elias. You spoke of his dying wish. You do not have to hide the burden anymore." Garrison looked at the sealed envelope, then looked back at her deeply wounded face. The terrible realization hit him like a physical blow to the jaw. She had heard his delirious argument with a ghost, but she had only heard the scattered fragments of a broken sentence. "Tallulah, listen to me," Garrison pleaded, forcing himself to sit up entirely despite the burning agony in his torn shoulder. Elias wrote that the town would never accept a woman holding the deed, especially a woman they did not understand. He begged me to marry you. He believed a legal husband was the absolute only shield that could keep you safe from the Baron. And you refused. She finished for him, her massive hands trembling slightly as she crossed her thick arms defensively over her chest. You told him you cannot marry me. I understand, Garrison. You are an honorable man. You paid your life debt. You bled for me. But you do not have to sacrifice your entire life to marry a wild beast just because an old man asked you to. That is not why I refused, Garrison countered loudly, his deep voice vibrating with raw, desperate honesty. He reached his uninjured hand out toward her. I told him I cannot marry you just for the deed. I refuse to make our bond a miserable legal shield because I want a real marriage. I want it because I have fallen entirely, desperately in love with you. Tallulah stared at him. The words hung in the quiet air, beautiful and impossible. For a single fleeting second, a fragile light flickered in her bright blue eyes. But 20 years of toxic shame, 20 years of cruel mockery, and a lifetime of hiding in the shadows could not be erased by a single desperate declaration. Her deeply buried insecurities roared to life, drowning out his truth. She believed he was simply a deeply honorable soldier, willing to lie in order to save her feelings. She believed he was trying to protect her, even from her own heartbreak. "Do not lie to me," she whispered, a single heavy tear escaping her eye and rolling down her strong jaw. "Do not pity me. I know exactly what I am. I am too big. I am too wild. I am a monster that belongs in a cage. You deserve a delicate, gentle woman. You do not deserve to be shackled to a giant. You are the most gentle creature God ever placed upon this earth," Garrison swore heavily, his breathing ragged as exhaustion threatened to pull him under again. "You are exactly the woman I want." Tallulah did not answer. She simply turned away, wiping her face with the back of her massive hand. Garrison fought desperately to keep his eyes open, wanting to pull her into his arms, wanting to prove his absolute devotion. But the heavy blood loss and the lingering fever had taken too immense a toll. His vision blurred rapidly, and despite his fierce willpower, he slumped back against the pillows, falling into a deep, exhausted slumber. Tallulah waited until his breathing slowed into a steady, rhythmic cadence. The agonizing decision broke her own heart into a million jagged pieces, but she believed it was the absolute only way to set him free. She moved silently through the cabin, packing her meager clothing and a single loaf of bread into a small canvas sack. She placed the official deed to the ranch directly on top of the yellowed envelope by his bed. The land belonged to him now. He had earned it. Without making a single sound, she opened the heavy oak door and walked away from the only home she had ever known, disappearing completely into the freezing, dark mountains before dawn. Will the stoic horse trainer wake in time to track her through the treacherous mountain pass? Or will her profound fear of rejection cost them both their only chance at genuine happiness? The gray light of morning finally shattered the shadows within the cabin. Garrison woke with a sharp gasp, the lingering fog of his fever banished by the bitter cold drafting through the room. He turned his scarred head toward the hearth. The fire had died to gray ash. The small chair by the window was empty. Panic seized his chest. He threw off the heavy wool blankets, ignoring the blinding pain that flared across his bandaged wound. On the small table, the yellowed envelope sat exactly where she had left it. Resting directly on top was the parchment deed to the Elias ranch. Her canvas sack was missing. Her coat was gone. Garrison did not curse, he did not hesitate. He forced his towering, battered frame into his heavy winter coat, his breathing ragged but deeply resolute. He strapped on his gun belt, saddled his weary roan gelding with one good arm, and rode directly into the blinding white expanse of the mountain pass. The snow was deep and treacherous, but she had carved a massive, unbroken trail through the drifts. He pushed the horse ruthlessly, driven by a terrifying fear that he had lost the absolute best thing he had ever known. The biting wind tore at his bandaged shoulder, sending sharp spikes of agony through his chest, but he refused to stop. He found her near the crest of the Howling Ridge, 3 miles from the property line. Tallulah was trudging slowly through the knee-deep snow, her towering frame bowed against the wind. She looked entirely broken, a magnificent giant surrendering to a lifetime of cruel lies. "Tallulah!" Garrison roared over the bitter wind, his deep voice carrying the raw, desperate weight of a man fighting for his absolute life. She froze. She slowly turned around, her bright blue eyes wide with complete disbelief as the stoic veteran rode through the heavy drifts. He practically threw himself from the saddle, closing the distance between them. "You foolish, beautiful woman," he breathed heavily, standing directly in front of her. His weathered face was pale from blood loss, but his sharp eyes burned with an undeniable, unyielding fire. "Did you honestly believe I would let you walk away?" Tallulah trembled violently. "You belong on the ranch, Garrison. You have the deed. I am setting you free. You cannot want a woman whose hands are as calloused and thick as iron. I do not want the deed." Garrison shouted, his voice cracking with profound emotion as he stripped away the last remaining layers of his heavy, stoic armor. "I do not care about the land. I do not care about Elias. I care about the woman who lifted a crushing roof to save a fragile foal. I care about the woman who stood against starving wolves to protect my blind spot. You are not a burden, Tallulah. You are my absolute salvation." He reached out, taking her massive, shaking hands into his own weathered palms. "For 20 years, this world has told you that you are a monster," Garrison murmured, his voice softening into a rich, gentle rhythm. They were terrified because they could not understand a woman who possesses the physical strength of a mountain and a heart made of pure grace. "You are not a wild beast. You are a queen, and I am asking you to come home with me, not as a ward, not as a shield, as my equal, as my wife." The deep, agonizing wall of toxic shame that had trapped her entire life finally shattered. Tallulah let out a raw, broken sob, falling forward into his broad chest. He wrapped his arms tightly around her massive shoulders, holding her securely against the freezing wind. In that profound, silent embrace, she finally realized she did not have to hide her size, her strength, or her heart ever again. She was deeply, unconditionally loved exactly as she was. The years that followed the brutal winter were profoundly gentle to the Elias Ranch. The cruel land baron was quietly run out of the territory by the townsfolk, their prejudices deeply shamed by the absolute dignity they had witnessed. Slowly, the town learned to live beside the giants on the mountain. Dr. Vance became a frequent guest, sharing hearty stews by the warm hearth. The merchants began to greet them with respectful nods when they rode for supplies. But the true beauty of their story lived entirely within the quiet, sacred sanctuary they built together. They rebuilt the eastern barn, working in perfect, silent harmony under the summer sun. Garrison healed entirely, his haunted eyes now filled with a bright, steady peace. Tallulah never wore long sleeves to hide her striking, muscular arms again. She walked across their golden pastures with a towering pride, her wild blonde hair flowing freely in the mountain breeze. She realized her immense power was not a curse, but a unique gift that kept her family completely safe. In the quiet evenings, when the hearth fire crackled softly in the cabin, they sat side by side. He would meticulously oil his leather harness, and she would mend his worn shirts, their massive hands brushing in the dim light. They did not need excessive words. They had found an emotional redemption so profound that it entirely healed the broken places within them both. She was the immovable mountain that sheltered him, and he was the protector who finally taught her how to stand in the light. They had survived the storms, defeated the shadows, and claimed a completely unbreakable belonging.